The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the sidewalk cafe in downtown Los Angeles. Keanu Reeves sat at a small table outside, his faithful golden retriever, Rufus, lounging lazily at his feet. The world seemed at peace. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, and the chatter of patrons filled the air, blending with the occasional sound of a car passing by. Keanu sipped his coffee, glancing down at Rufus as the dog gave him a soft, contented wag of his tail. For Keanu, moments like these were the epitome of tranquility. He could escape from the hustle and bustle of the world, if only for a few minutes, to enjoy the simple joys of life. The morning was just another ordinary day, until it wasn't. As Keanu reached for his cup again, his peaceful world shattered. A loud thud echoed through the air, followed by a yelp that cut through the calm. Keanu's eyes shot up just in time to see a tall, broad-shouldered man on a motorcycle ride past, his foot swinging out and connecting with Rufus's side. The dog yelped again, stumbling backward as the biker sped off without a second glance. Keanu's heart stopped for a moment. The world around him seemed to slow as he processed what had just happened. He shot up from his chair, his coffee forgotten, and rushed to Rufus's side. The dog was on the ground, whimpering and shaking. The biker, a rough-looking man with dark sunglasses and a leather jacket, was already disappearing down the street, his motorcycle's engine roaring in the distance. "Rufus!" Keanu called out, dropping to his knees beside the dog. He gently cupped the dog's face, his fingers trembling with concern. "Are you okay, buddy?" Rufus's eyes were wide with confusion and fear, his body tense. But there was no visible injury. Yet the pain in Keanu's chest felt deep and immediate. How could anyone do something like that? His hands shook as he checked the dog's body for bruises or cuts. Thankfully, there was nothing major, but Keanu couldn't shake the anger that bubbled up inside him. The biker hadn't even cared to stop. He hadn't even looked back. "Stay here," Keanu murmured to Rufus, gently patting the dog's head. His eyes followed the biker's retreating form. Rage started to build within him. Keanu wasn't one to confront people easily, but this was different. Before he could even think about what to do next, a voice broke the silence. What the hell was that about? A woman sitting at the next table looked at him with concern. She had witnessed the whole thing. "That guy just kicked your dog and kept going like it was nothing." Keanu nodded, still kneeling beside Rufus. "Yeah, I'm going to find him." The woman glanced around, her eyes scanning the street. "That's insane. You're not just going to let that slide, are you?" Keanu stood up, his resolve hardening. "No, I'm not." The woman hesitated, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief. "Be careful, though. Some people don't react well when they're confronted." Keanu didn't respond. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he couldn't just sit by. Not when Rufus had been hurt, even if it was just a bruise. To his pride. As he glanced down the street, trying to spot the biker, Keanu's thoughts were interrupted by Rufus, who stood shakily, wagging his tail weakly, as if trying to reassure him. The dog's spirit, as always, was unbroken. Keanu smiled at the dog, his anger turning to determination. He'd find the man. He'd make sure there were consequences for his actions. But first, he needed to make sure Rufus was all right. The biker could wait. Little did Keanu know, the events of this morning were only the beginning of a much larger journey, a journey that would not only change the lives of him and his dog, but also a man who in that moment was completely unaware of the impact his actions would soon have. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As Keanu and Rufus settled back into their quiet corner of the cafe, a strange sense of calm settled over him. The biker had gone, and the confrontation was over, at least for now. Rufus, seemingly unscathed but still a little shaken, curled up at Keanu's feet, his soft breathing the only sound breaking the silence. Keanu couldn't help but replay the encounter in his mind. The anger, the way the biker had dismissed him, the ease with which he had hurt an innocent animal, it all left a bitter taste in his mouth. But more than that, the moment when the biker realized who Keanu was, when the arrogance and defiance faltered, had been telling. Keanu leaned back in his chair, staring at his coffee, now lukewarm. He wanted to put the whole thing behind him. But as much as he tried to shake it off, the confrontation with the biker nagged at him. The guy was still out there, carrying on with his life like nothing had happened. But Keanu wasn't one to just move on easily. What kind of person does that, he thought. Keanu had seen a lot in his life, people who had lost their way, made mistakes, and learned the hard way. And while he could easily have shrugged the whole thing off, the way the biker had acted suggested something deeper, something Keanu couldn't quite place. Across the cafe, a woman sitting at a nearby table, who had witnessed the entire scene, kept glancing over at him. Keanu caught her eye and she gave him a small knowing nod. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but concerned. Keanu smiled faintly. "Yeah, just thinking." "About that guy?" she asked, with a glance toward where the biker had vanished. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, he didn't even stop to apologize." The woman raised an eyebrow. "People like that. They don't think they need to apologize for anything." "I don't get it," Keanu muttered, frustration creeping back into his voice. "I mean, how do you just hurt a dog and walk away without a second thought?" The woman looked thoughtful for a moment, then shrugged. "Some people don't care. Maybe it's not even about the dog. Maybe it's something bigger for him. People who lash out at others are usually hurting inside." Keanu turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "So you think he's just angry? Frustrated?" "Probably," she cut in. "I don't know his story, but it doesn't excuse his behavior. It's just the way some people deal with their problems by making someone else feel bad." Keanu sat back, absorbing her words. It made sense in a way, but that didn't excuse what had happened. The anger still lingered. Maybe it wasn't about just the dog. Maybe, as she said, there was something deeper going on with the biker. But what bothered Keanu the most was how little he cared. How he could lash out and cause pain without even considering the consequences. "I guess you're right," Keanu said, after a long pause. "But I still can't shake the feeling that he needs to understand what he did. I just don't know how to get him to see that." The woman gave a slight nod, but before she could respond, the sound of a motorcycle engine revving up outside the cafe broke through their conversation. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. Could it be him again? He stood up abruptly, looking toward the door, his eyes scanning the street. The biker had returned, but this time Keanu didn't just feel anger. It was something else, something more dangerous. He didn't know what he would do if the man tried something again. His pulse quickened as the motorcycle came into view, pulling into the spot right in front of the cafe. The man dismounted, shaking his helmet off. His eyes immediately locked onto Keanu's. For a moment, the biker hesitated, looking like he wasn't sure whether to approach. Keanu's mind raced, wondering what had brought him back. Was he looking for trouble again, or was there something else on his mind? Without warning, the biker took a few steps toward Keanu. There was no anger in his posture now, just something different, almost apologetic. He seemed less sure of himself this time. Keanu stood still, his body tense, but not reacting. He wasn't going to let his anger get the best of him. Not now. "Hey," the biker called, his voice rough but not aggressive. "You're Keanu, right?" Keanu didn't respond immediately, waiting for him to continue. I need to talk to you," the biker said, his voice dropping. He shifted on his feet, clearly uneasy. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "About what?" The biker hesitated before speaking. "Look, I'm sorry. What I did to your dog, I shouldn't have done that. It was messed up. I don't know. I was frustrated, and I just took it out on the wrong thing." He paused, staring at the ground for a moment, then met Keanu's eyes. "I've been angry for a while, but that's no excuse. I shouldn't have kicked your dog." Keanu stood there, stunned. He had expected more hostility or defensiveness, not this strange sense of guilt radiating off the man. "I've been going through some stuff," the biker continued, his voice quieter now, "and I just lost control. I know it doesn't make it right, but I'm trying to make it right at least." Keanu studied him, feeling a shift in the air between them. This wasn't the arrogant, uncaring man from before. There was something vulnerable here now, something that, for all the anger Keanu had felt earlier, made him stop and reconsider. "You want to make it right?" Keanu asked, his voice softer than before. "Then start by making sure it never happens again. Think before you act. It's not just about apologizing to me. It's about changing what's inside." The biker nodded, looking remorseful. "Yeah, I will." Keanu was silent for a moment, watching the man. The anger had faded, replaced by something else, sympathy maybe, or even understanding. He didn't have to like the biker, but he could see the effort in his eyes. "You've got a long road ahead of you," Keanu said, turning toward the cafe, "but you've taken the first step." The biker watched him for a long moment before finally giving a small nod. "Thanks for giving me a chance." Keanu didn't say anything more as he turned back to Rufus, who had perked up at the sound of the voices. Keanu gave him a soft smile and rubbed the dog's ears gently. Maybe people could change. Maybe they needed a push in the right direction. But no matter what, Keanu knew he'd made the right choice. Not just for Rufus, but for the biker too, Baltharov. Biker's apology had caught Keanu off guard. As the man walked away, leaving the cafe behind, Keanu found himself in a strange limbo. Part of him wanted to hold on to the anger he had felt earlier, to maintain that sense of justice. But another part of him wondered if the biker's actions were the beginning of something bigger. Rufus, sensing his owner's change in demeanor, padded over and nudged Keanu's leg with his nose. Keanu smiled softly, ruffling the dog's fur. "You're a good boy, Rufus," Keanu said, his voice carrying a softness that belied the complexity of the moment. The dog wagged his tail in response, as if reassuring Keanu that everything would be okay. Still, the encounter had left him unsettled. It wasn't just about the biker's apology or Rufus's brief scare. It was the realization that sometimes people acted out of pain, and that it wasn't always about what was right or wrong, but the struggles they carried inside. Keanu couldn't help but think about the biker's words. "I've been going through some stuff." What did that mean? Was he just dealing with anger, or was it something deeper? The questions lingered in his mind, unanswered, as he finished the last of his coffee. But before Keanu could get too lost in his thoughts, a commotion from across the street broke his concentration. A group of people had gathered, murmuring excitedly, and Keanu's curiosity piqued. He stood up, Rufus following closely at his heels, and walked toward the crowd. As he approached, the crowd parted slightly, and Keanu's gaze locked onto a figure standing at the center, the biker. But this wasn't the same man who had left the cafe. His posture was different now, tense, almost defensive, and the people around him weren't offering apologies or sympathy. They were yelling, "Get out of here, man. You don't belong in this neighborhood. You think you can just hurt animals and walk away like nothing happened? You've got another thing coming." Keanu's stomach tightened as he pushed his way through the crowd. The biker's expression was one of confusion, desperation even, and Keanu's heart went out to him. It was clear now that this wasn't just a man with anger issues. It was someone who had fallen into a pattern of self-destruction. As Keanu moved closer, one of the people in the crowd noticed him and pointed, voice rising. "Hey, isn't that Keanu Reeves? What's he doing with this guy?" The crowd's energy shifted, becoming more focused on Keanu. They seemed to think that because of his celebrity status, he would be on their side. He was expected to add fuel to the fire. But Keanu didn't move toward the group. Instead, he took another step toward the biker. "Hey, it's okay," Keanu called out, his voice calm yet firm. The crowd hushed momentarily, unsure how to react. The biker turned to him, eyes wide with shock. "Keanu? What the hell are you doing here?" Keanu offered a small, reassuring smile. "I'm here to make sure this doesn't get out of hand," the crowd muttered among themselves. Someone called out, "He deserves to be called out, Keanu. He kicked that dog." Keanu turned to the person who'd spoken, his expression thoughtful but not confrontational. "You're right. What he did wasn't okay. But there's more to this than just one bad choice." The tension in the air grew thicker, the crowd unsure of how to handle the situation now that Keanu was involved. Keanu could feel the weight of their expectations, but his eyes never left the biker. He wasn't sure why he was so invested in this man's story. This stranger who had hurt his dog and then returned to apologize, but there was something raw in his eyes. Something that called out to Keanu. Something that mirrored his own experiences of losing control and not knowing how to make it right. Look, Keanu continued, addressing the crowd. I get it. You're angry, you should be. But anger doesn't fix things, it just makes them worse. He paused, his gaze flickering back to the biker, who stood with his head slightly lowered. Sometimes, people need help. And that's what I'm offering him. Not just a second chance, but a path forward. The crowd was silent for a beat, unsure of how to respond. Keanu knew he wasn't going to win everyone over. Some people wanted justice. Some people just wanted to vent their anger. But Keanu wasn't offering retribution. He was offering something else, a chance to heal, to move forward. Finally, one of the crowd members spoke up, more quietly now. You think he'll really change? Keanu looked at the biker, who was still standing in place, avoiding eye contact. I don't know, but everyone deserves the chance to try. After a long moment of silence, the crowd began to disperse. Their mutterings turned into reluctant conversations and the tension slowly ebbed away. Keanu remained beside the biker, who seemed to be struggling with his own emotions. I'm sorry, the biker said again, his voice thick with guilt. I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know why I did it. Keanu studied him for a long moment before speaking. Maybe it's not about knowing right now. Maybe it's about choosing to be better from here on out. It's not too late. The biker nodded slowly, his eyes hardening with determination. Yeah, I can do that. Keanu gave a small smile and clapped him on the back. Good. And hey, he added, looking down at the biker's worn leather jacket, you might want to lose the jacket. Not a great look. The biker chuckled lightly, breaking the tension between them. Yeah, maybe you're right. The two stood there for a moment, the bond of understanding between them forming where anger once was. Keanu glanced down at Rufus, who had settled calmly at his feet. The dog's eyes were calm, his tail wagging gently, as if he knew this chapter had come to a close. The battle was over, for now. But the journey wasn't. Keanu turned back to the biker. You've got a long road ahead of you, but it's a road worth walking. As they exchanged a final glance, Keanu realized something that had been nagging at him for hours. Maybe this wasn't just about the biker or the dog. Maybe it was about all of them. The past, the mistakes, the chances they were all given, and whether they would take them. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. The crowd had scattered, but the air was still thick with the residue of tension. Keanu stood in the middle of the sidewalk, his feet rooted to the ground. The biker, now looking somewhat defeated but oddly relieved, had taken a few steps back, his face still a mixture of shame and something else. Vulnerability, perhaps. Keanu couldn't ignore the feeling that something was still unresolved, lingering between them. Rufus, seemingly content that the storm had passed, sat down on the pavement, his tail lazily thumping against the ground. Keanu's gaze softened as he looked down at his dog, who had always been there for him through thick and thin. But it wasn't just Rufus who Keanu was thinking about. It was the biker, this stranger who had been angry enough to hurt an innocent animal, but who had now apologized, owned up to his actions, and seemed to genuinely want to change. Keanu's thoughts were interrupted by the hum of an approaching car. He looked up and saw a sleek black SUV pulling up to the curb. The windows rolled down, and to Keanu's surprise, a familiar face leaned out. It was Chad, one of Keanu's old friends, an actor, but more importantly, someone who knew the struggles Keanu had faced in the past. Keanu! You wouldn't believe the traffic, Chad called out, flashing a quick grin before his gaze shifted to the biker. The friendly smile faded into something more guarded, something Keanu recognized. Chad wasn't just surprised to see the biker. He was sizing him up. Before Keanu could say anything, Chad had already gotten out of the car, moving toward him. Everything okay? Chad asked, looking from Keanu to the biker, his tone laced with suspicion. Keanu nodded. Yeah. Everything's fine. Just some guy who got a little angry earlier but wanted to make things right. Chad raised an eyebrow. That's interesting, he said, still eyeing the biker. Trust him. Keanu gave a half shrug. I don't know if I trust him yet, but I believe people can change. Chad didn't seem convinced, but he gave a brief nod and turned his attention to the biker. You're not one of those guys who just says sorry and thinks that fixes everything, are you? The biker looked up at Chad, as if caught off guard by the question. His eyes flickered to Keanu for reassurance, but Keanu said nothing. He wanted the biker to speak for himself. No, the biker replied, his voice soft but firm. I know, it's not enough to say sorry, but I'm gonna do better. I know I have to. Chad didn't answer right away, but there was a shift in his posture, a slight softening in his eyes. He'd known Keanu long enough to see when he was serious about something, and that was when Chad sighed, exhaling slowly as if releasing years of pent-up frustration. All right, you want to prove yourself, Chad said, his voice surprisingly gentle now. Start by helping others. I know a few programs that could use someone who's serious about making a change. He looked back at Keanu and gave him a wry smile. And I'm sure Keanu here will keep you on track. The biker's face brightened for a moment, but then doubt flickered in his eyes. You think I could really— You're not going to do it alone, Keanu interrupted, his voice calm but firm. You'll need help, but we all do. I've been there, trust me. The hardest part is starting. The biker nodded slowly, his jaw set with determination. All right, I'll try. Keanu could see the sincerity in his eyes now, and it struck him. The biker was on the edge of a massive change, but like everyone else, he needed someone to help him take the first step. Keanu had been given so many chances in his own life. Maybe this was the biker's turn. Rufus let out a soft woof, his tail wagging a little faster. Keanu looked down at him and smiled, shaking his head. The dog had a way of lightening the mood, even in the most unexpected of moments. Just as Keanu was about to speak again, a voice broke through the small lull in the conversation. I think I could use a little help too, the biker said, his tone now filled with quiet resolve. I don't have anyone else to turn to. Chad, still standing with his arms crossed, finally cracked a smile. That's what we're here for, he said, giving a slight nod in Keanu's direction. Keanu looked at the biker, then back at Chad, and then at Rufus, who had already begun to wag his tail in approval. In that moment, Keanu realized that life had a funny way of throwing people together, sometimes in moments of conflict, sometimes in moments of redemption, but it always came down to one thing, the willingness to step up and be there for each other. I think we're just getting started, Keanu said, his voice full of quiet conviction. The biker smiled for the first time, a small but genuine smile that spoke volumes. Thanks, he muttered. Keanu gave a slight smile in return, a deep sense of satisfaction filling his chest. No problem. Just remember, this is your journey, but you're not alone. For a moment, everything felt like it had clicked into place. The anger, the frustration, and the uncertainty had all melted away, leaving only hope. Hope that even in the darkest of times, change was possible. Hope that when people were ready to reach out, there were always others willing to offer a hand. As the days passed, Keanu found himself thinking more and more about the biker. What began as a simple act of anger had evolved into something much deeper, an opportunity for change, for growth, and for healing. The biker, whose name turned out to be Jason, had taken Keanu's words to heart. Jason had started showing up at the local animal shelters, volunteering his time, doing what he could to make up for the harm he had caused. Keanu had offered to help him find a better path, and though he had his doubts at first, Jason had proved he was committed to it. It wasn't easy for Jason. His past wasn't one he could simply escape. There were scars, both physical and emotional, that he carried with him every day. But he showed up day after day trying to do something right. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about taking responsibility one step at a time. Keanu hadn't been able to help much in the beginning. His schedule was often packed, but he kept in touch with Jason, offering words of encouragement when needed. And Rufus, true to form, never seemed to tire of making sure that Jason felt welcome, even on the rough days. A week later, Keanu invited Jason to join him for a coffee again, this time at a different cafe. It was a small, quieter spot near the beach, where the ocean breeze mingled with the scent of fresh coffee. Jason had been nervous at first, unsure if he was ready to face Keanu in a more casual setting, but Keanu had reassured him that this was about a new beginning, not about looking back. The two sat outside on the patio, the waves crashing softly. In the distance, as they shared their thoughts, Jason shifted in his seat, his eyes downcast as he stirred his coffee. "I never realized how much damage I was causing," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "I thought I was just angry, but there was more to it. So much more. I was running from stuff I didn't even know how to deal with." Keanu nodded, understanding. Exactly what Jason meant. Anger often masked deeper pain. It was easier to lash out than to face the mess of emotions that had been buried for years. Keanu had done it himself. He had buried his own struggles behind a smile, behind his fame and behind the image everyone expected him to portray. "I get it," Keanu said softly. "Anger is easy, but it's not a long-term solution. You have to deal with what's underneath it all, and sometimes that takes more courage than anything else." Jason looked up at Keanu, his expression both grateful and skeptical. "I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to be better, but sometimes I feel like I'm not making enough of a difference." Keanu smiled, offering his usual calm reassurance. "It's not about making a huge difference right away. It's about doing what you can, when you can, and letting that build over time. What you're doing now, with the shelter, with the animals, it matters. Don't underestimate the impact you're having." Jason was quiet for a moment, absorbing Keanu's words. He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes distant. "I just want to make sure that I'm doing this for the right reasons. Not for me, not for anyone else, but for the things I hurt, for the animals, for myself too." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. The road to redemption is never a straight line. It's messy, it's difficult, and it's full of ups and downs. But the fact that you're here, that you're trying, that's the important part. Jason smiled, albeit a little uncertainly. "I don't know if I'll ever completely make up for what I did. I can't change the past." "You're right," Keanu agreed. "You can't change the past. None of us can. But what you can do is shape your future, one choice at a time." Rufus, who had been quietly sitting by Keanu's side, stood up and padded over to Jason. With a wag of his tail, the dog nudged Jason's hand with his nose, looking up at him with trusting eyes. Jason chuckled, a soft, genuine sound. "He's a good dog," he said, reaching down to scratch behind Rufus's ears. Keanu smiled, watching the interaction. "Yeah, he's a good judge of character." The three of them sat there for a long while, sipping their coffee, watching the waves, and sharing the quiet peace that only the ocean could bring. In that moment, Keanu realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It wasn't about righting every wrong or achieving perfection. It was about understanding growth and being willing to take responsibility, no matter how difficult it might be. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jason spoke again, his voice steady but filled with a new sense of purpose. "I'm not perfect, but I'm getting better," he said, "and I'm grateful for the chance to start again." Keanu nodded, his smile widening. "We all deserve that chance." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a soft glow, and for the first time Keanu truly believed that the biker, Jason, was on the right path. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was his road to walk, and he was no longer walking it alone. Rufus, sensing the peace in the air, lay down beside Keanu, his tail still wagging gently. It was a simple moment, a quiet one, but one filled with the promise of change. And for Keanu, that was enough. The weeks following that conversation at the beach cafe were not as smooth as Keanu would have liked. Jason's road to redemption, though well-intentioned, was far from straightforward. There were moments of doubt, setbacks, and even relapses, but what Keanu had said to him kept ringing in his mind. It's not about making a huge difference right away. It's about doing what you can, when you can, and letting that build over time. Jason kept showing up at the shelter, at community meetings, volunteering whenever he could. Each day felt like an uphill battle, but the small victories began to add up. He had learned that every day was a chance to move forward, and it wasn't just about the animals anymore. It was about himself. He was slowly beginning to realize that making amends wasn't about seeking forgiveness from others. It was about forgiving himself. But there were days when the weight of his past threatened to crush him. When he saw the people he used to hang out with, the ones who were still angry and bitter, he couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. He missed the simplicity of his old life, even if it had been filled with chaos. The pull to fall back into old habits, to escape the hard work of change, was a constant battle. One night, after a particularly tough shift at the shelter, Jason found himself sitting on a park bench, his head buried in his hands. He wasn't sure what he was doing anymore. The loneliness crept in, as it often did, and the doubts began to swirl again. It was then that he felt a familiar presence beside him. Jason didn't need to look up to know who it was. Keanu had a way of showing up just when he needed him, even if he didn't always say much. The older man sat down quietly next to him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Jason. "You good?" Keanu's voice broke the silence, gentle but knowing. Jason sighed deeply, not bothering to look up. "I don't know. Some days are better than others, but I can't shake the feeling like I'm stuck in the past. Every time I think I'm making progress, something pulls me back." Keanu remained silent for a moment, letting Jason speak his truth. It was a familiar feeling, one Keanu himself had battled for years. The weight of past mistakes never truly disappeared, no matter how much one tried to move forward. "It's hard," Keanu said finally. "Change is never easy. You're going to have those moments. It's not about being perfect, it's about getting back up, even when you feel like you can't." Jason shook his head. "I don't know if I can keep doing this. I keep thinking about all the things I've done wrong. And every time I make one step forward, I feel like I take 2 steps back." Keanu placed a hand on Jason's shoulder, a simple but supportive gesture. "You don't have to do it alone. You've got people who believe in you." Jason met Keanu's eyes for the first time in what felt like ages. "You really think so?" "I know so," Keanu said firmly. "There's no shame in struggling, but what matters is that you're still here, you're still trying." Jason's eyes softened. For the first time in weeks, he felt a weight lift off his chest. Keanu's words, simple as they were, had a way of cutting through the fog of doubt that clouded his mind. He hadn't been alone in his struggles all this time. Keanu had been right there beside him, offering guidance and a steady hand when Jason needed it most. Keanu stood up and looked down at Jason, his voice full of quiet encouragement. "Look, it's a long road, and yeah, there are going to be bumps along the way. But you've already made it this far, don't throw it all away now." Jason slowly stood as well, the weight in his chest easing, if only a little. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, he felt a flicker of hope. "I won't give up," Jason said, his voice filled with resolve. "I'm not going to let my past define me anymore." Keanu nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "Good. That's the first step." As Jason walked away that night, a sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't that all his problems had been solved, but the realization that he wasn't fighting this battle alone made all the difference. There was something powerful in knowing that, even on the darkest days, he had a support system. People who cared. People who believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Back at the cafe the next morning, Jason found himself with Rufus again, sipping coffee as the sun rose higher into the sky. The small moments, these fleeting instances of calm, had become his anchor. It was here, in the simplicity of a quiet morning with the dog by his side, that he felt grounded. This was his life now. No longer a reckless, angry man seeking escape, but someone slowly but surely choosing to move forward. And as he watched Rufus nudge his hand, a smile crossed his face. "Thanks, buddy," Jason whispered to the dog, who wagged his tail in response as if to say, "You're doing just fine." Keanu had been right. It wasn't about making big changes overnight. It was about each small step, each choice to do better. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like he was headed in the right direction. The days that followed were filled with the kind of quiet progress that Jason had come to appreciate. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fast, but it was steady. He was learning to trust the process, to trust that the steps he took now would eventually lead to something better. He had even found a rhythm volunteering at the shelter and doing small community service projects. The feeling of helping others, of knowing he was doing something good, was slowly chipping away at the guilt and anger that had once defined him. But even in the midst of his progress, life had a way of testing him, as it often did when people least expected it. The storm that Jason had been waiting for, one he had tried so hard to avoid, was coming. It began on a Thursday afternoon when Jason was picking up supplies at a local hardware store. He was just starting to feel like he belonged in this world. That was so different from the one he had known. But that world didn't always play fair. As he turned down an aisle, gathering the last of what he needed for the shelter's new dog run, he froze. The sound of familiar voices caught his attention. Loud, boisterous voices that brought with them memories of a past he was still trying to outrun. A few feet down the aisle, 3 men were laughing, their presence filling the space with an uncomfortable familiarity. Jason recognized them instantly. Kyle, Danny, and Jake, the same group of guys he used to hang with. They had all been part of the life he was trying to leave behind, the late-night parties, the reckless behavior, and, worst of, all the anger that he had allowed to dictate every decision he made. The sight of them instantly set his nerves on edge. He stood frozen, half hidden behind a display, unsure of what to do. He knew that if they saw him, it could mean everything he had worked for, the progress, the change, the redemption, could come crashing down. "Hey, look who it is," Kyle's voice rang out, followed by a loud laugh. "Jason, long time no see, man." Jason's stomach turned, his hands instinctively tightening around the basket of supplies. He didn't want to face them, didn't want to confront the version of himself they still saw him as. He was no longer that angry, reckless person. He had worked so hard to bury that part of him. But in a split second, that part of him came roaring to the surface, like an old ghost that refused to be forgotten. "Don't just stand there. Come on over, man," Jake called, his voice full of mock cheerfulness. "What are you up to these days? Still doing that helping the animals thing? Man, what a joke." Jason's breath caught in his throat, but he stood his ground. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. His old instincts told him to walk away, to ignore them, but the anger still burned deep inside of him. It would have been so easy to lash out, to tell them off, to let all the frustration and bitterness he had kept bottled up explode. But that wasn't who he was anymore. The whole point of his journey had been to not react the way he used to. Jason took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I'm doing fine. Actually, things are a lot better for me now," Danny scoffed. "Better? You're kidding, right? You think anyone actually buys that crap?" The taunts and jabs started coming faster, aimed at everything Jason had worked to rebuild. His new life, his volunteering, even his relationship with Keanu and Rufus. They were trying to pull him back in, drag him into the muck they had stayed, stuck in, and it almost worked. Jason's hands trembled slightly, the old anger bubbling up inside of him. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the temptation to fight back overwhelming. He hadn't forgotten what these guys were capable of, how they had pushed him to act out in ways that hurt both himself and others. For a brief moment, Jason felt trapped. The weight of the past seemed to collapse on him all at once, like a wave threatening to drown him. He didn't know how much longer he could keep fighting, but then something clicked. In the midst of the chaos swirling inside his head, he remembered Keanu's words. "It's about getting back up even when you feel like you can't." Jason exhaled slowly and looked Kyle in the eye, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not that person anymore," he said quietly. "You guys can keep acting the way you want, but I'm not doing this with you. Not anymore." For a long moment, Kyle and the others were silent, their sneers faltering for just a beat. Then Kyle scoffed again, shaking his head. "Whatever, man, suit yourself. But don't come crawling back to us when you realize you're just a joke." Jason felt the sting of the words, but it didn't pierce as deeply as it would have in the past. It still hurt, but he was stronger now. He had learned to let go of the need for validation from people who would never understand the changes he was making. With a final glance, Jason turned and walked away, leaving the mocking laughter behind him. As he stepped outside into the fresh air, Jason's chest tightened. But it wasn't from anger. It was from something else, something unfamiliar. Pride. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud of the person he had become. He hadn't given in to the old temptations. He hadn't let the ghosts of his past pull him back into the darkness. It was a small victory, but it was his. Jason got in his car, his hands steady on the wheel. He knew there would be other tests, other moments when life would try to drag him down. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had people who believed in him, people like Keanu and Rufus, and for the first time, he truly believed in himself. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Jason felt the shift. The storm, both literal and metaphorical, had passed, and as he looked out over the horizon, he felt a calm settle over him that he had not experienced in years. He had faced his demons, confronted the ghosts of his past, and though there would always be struggles ahead, he knew he was stronger now. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was his road to walk. The uncertainty didn't scare him as much anymore. Jason had spent the last few months finding peace in small, everyday moments, working at the shelter, spending time with Rufus, and even meeting Keanu for coffee now and then. But this day, this particular morning, felt different. There was a weightlessness to the air, like something inside him had finally clicked into place. He drove to the shelter early, as he did every Sunday. But today was special. It had been 3 months since that fateful encounter at the cafe, the day he had kicked Rufus in anger. 3 months since Keanu had shown him the path to redemption. Not through grand gestures, but through patience, understanding, and the willingness to take small steps forward, even when it felt impossible. As Jason walked into the shelter that morning, he saw the same faces, both the animals and the people who had become his second family. But today something felt different. He could see the positive changes in the shelter, in the faces of the volunteers, in the way the animals responded to him. They were learning to trust him again, just as he was learning to trust himself. He walked to the kennel area where he saw one of the dogs he'd been working with, a scrappy little terrier named Charlie, wagging his tail excitedly as he approached. Charlie had been one of the hardest cases he had worked on, but after weeks of care, training, and patience, the dog had begun to open up. Jason knelt down, offering his hand as Charlie bounded forward, licking his face in delight. "Good boy, Charlie," Jason murmured, his heart swelling with pride. A few minutes later, Keanu arrived, as he often did on Sundays. He walked over to Jason with a knowing smile. "You look different," Keanu said, his eyes warm and appreciative. Jason smiled back, standing up and brushing the dirt from his jeans. "I feel different. It's like something clicked." Keanu nodded, as if he'd been waiting for Jason to reach this moment. "It's called growth, and you're doing it." They stood together, watching the animals, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. It wasn't awkward silence, it was a peaceful silence, the kind that came from understanding. Jason glanced over at Keanu. "I've come a long way, haven't I?" "You have," Keanu agreed, "and you're not done yet, but that's okay." "No, one ever really is." Jason nodded, taking in the depth of that statement. He had been so focused on the mistakes of his past that he had forgotten to look at how far he had come. The road hadn't been easy, and it still wasn't, but he wasn't where he used to be, and that was enough. "You know," Jason said, his voice quieter now, "I used to think that all the mistakes I made would always define me, that no matter what I did, I'd never be able to outrun them." Keanu looked at him, his expression gentle but knowing. "That's a lie. The only person who can define you is you. You just have to believe it." Jason thought about that for a moment. For the first time in his life, he realized that he had the power to redefine himself, not by what he had done in the past, but by what he chose to do every single day going forward. He wasn't perfect, and he knew he never would be, but he was enough, and that was what truly mattered. The two men stood together for a few more minutes, soaking in the calm of the moment. Keanu then patted Jason on the back. "I think Rufus would be proud of you," he said with a grin. Jason laughed. "Yeah, well, if he's ever up for giving me a second chance, I'm ready." Keanu's grin widened, and for a brief moment, the tension that had once defined their relationship disappeared entirely. Jason had learned a valuable lesson through all of this, that redemption wasn't about grand gestures or miraculous changes. It was about doing the right thing every single day, even when it was hard. Later that afternoon, Jason found himself sitting with Rufus in the park, the dog lying next to him as they both watched the world go by. The breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and Jason felt at peace for the first time in a long while. He wasn't who he used to be, and that was okay. He was still learning, still growing, but now he had hope. He had purpose, and he had people in his life who believed in him. That was enough. As he glanced down at Rufus, who nuzzled against his side, Jason chuckled softly. "We've come a long way, huh, buddy?" Rufus responded by wagging his tail, as if to say, "Yeah, we have. And we'll keep going." Jason smiled and stood up, Rufus following close behind. They walked back to the car, the sun setting in the distance. The world felt wide open, full of possibilities, and for the first time, Jason was ready to embrace whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?